the biggest factor here in determining that threshold and that sweet spot is going to be the amount of stress. And there's several factors that are going to affect it. So one is just as simple as calories in, right? The fuel in, even though we don't think of it in terms of calories, but a lot of people would. And that, of course, is going to be a factor. But also there's all the factors that affect that conversion to energy. So the amount of energy we have available is going to be a major factor determining the amount of stress that we experience. And then the next is going to be the amount of energy demand. So again, how much are we exercising in a week, in a day? Is it all at once within 30 minutes or an hour, or is it spread out over an extended period of time? So that's going to be another factor. But there are certain things that we'll point to now. I'm going to bring up a couple of studies that kind of give us some indication of where that level is. And I will say, again, in talking about the harms of stress and talking about the harms of excess exercise, that's already a little bit blasphemous, in the mainstream world, where the general idea is that there can be no harm from exercising a lot. More is better.
Eat less, exercise more.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's no thought given to the fact that this is literally taking away energy from everything else that you could be doing, or that your body could be doing. And it can come with a lot of issues. There's quite a bit of research talking about and looking through the harmful effects of excess exercise. And sometimes this is looking at elite athletes or Olympic athletes. Sometimes this is looking at long distance runners or marathoners. But when there is excessive amounts of physical activity, you tend to see various issues. And the first that we have talked about this before, that what you would generally see crop up are things like lower thyroid hormones, lower reproductive hormones, lower libido, all of the things that come with that. And that's going to be because there's literally less energy available to support those functions. And so our bodies will turn down that metabolic dial. They'll turn down their own energy production to conserve energy. And we've talked about this in the context of any other stressor, any other, pronounced or profound stressor, things like ketogenic diets, fasting, and on from there, any sort of low carb diet really, is that this will cause those same hormonal effects because there's a lack of energy. But you also see some other things too when you're looking at excessive exercise. You see excessive amounts of oxidative stress and damage to the mitochondria. You see various increases in inflammation markers. You actually see something that you talked about a lot, Mike, which is the acute phase response, something that we see really in response to any stressor. Oftentimes it was used to describe our response to infections, but basically it's a generalized inflammation response. And so you see that in response to excess exercise. You also see, and again, we've referenced these studies before, increased intestinal permeability. You even see endotoxemia, you see elevated serotonin as a result of excess exercise. And then you also see a lot of cardiovascular issues as well. Heart attacks, atherosclerosis, various like arterial stiffening and things like that, fibrosis. What were you saying there in terms of the heart effects?
The heart effects are specific to certain forms of exercise versus others, where it's more the long distance running or heavy endurance exercise leads to those complications.
Yeah, I think you tend to see these things more clearly or more frequently in that population, right? In the long distance endurance training. And I think, we'll talk about this, but I think part of the reason for that is because that is a type of training that tends to lead a lot more on the stress side and less so in the beneficial specific effects. And so you see these problems more frequently when you're looking at that sort of training.
Yeah. I think for me, the biggest example of what we're discussing here is the female athlete triad, where you see a complete loss of menstruation, which is essentially like overt hormone deficiency. And then you also see bone loss. And then you also see some degree, it can have disordered eating, but sometimes you don't actually have it. And it's essentially where your exercise, in certain sports, the exercise essentially is taking over the other functions of the individual's body, where their bones aren't able to maintain themselves and their hormonal systems aren't able to maintain themselves. And it's more specific to females, because I think the female reproductive system is a little bit more sensitive to these types of dynamics, because it's there to support an actual baby. So it's like the body will will move to a situation where it has to prioritize its own health, its own existence, over the ability to form a new organism. So it's, I mean, logically it does make sense, but I think it's a great example, and it's like a known thing at this point. And as I said before, it's just some degree of disordered eating. It may or may not be present. Bone loss, and then loss of menstruation, loss of the period in females who are exercising at a high level.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're saying, you see that a lot in, I guess, similar to or parallel to how you see it in long distance endurance training. You'll see these things more frequently in women, as you're saying, because there's more sensitivity hormonally due to the nature of being the being that needs to produce, like in the reproductive sense, produces a new baby, which is intensely energetically
expensive.
Yes, exactly. So there's much more sensitivity because of that.
And you tend to see this in women in endurance sports. And that's with the endurance sports, I think, if I remember reading correctly, that's where it's less the disordered eating in the endurance sports, and that's more from like the actual exercise issue. Whereas in some of the other female sports like ballet or gymnastics, the female triad comes from a combination of needing to maintain low body weight, so a lot of women starving themselves, and then exercising, so essentially eating less and exercising more. You basically wreck your hormonal system. So, yeah.
How could that be, Mike? I thought that's the only way to health and weight loss.
Well, it's just caloric restriction just leads to increased lifespan, and you just suffer the entire time.
Yeah. Of course, we're being facetious here. I'll link back to, again, those weight loss studies or episodes, and also the episode discussing caloric restriction and in terms of hormesis. Yeah, because we don't think these things are ideal. But I do want to, so circling back to the exercise point. So that's a great point with the female athlete triad. And I also want to bring some context to exactly, we were talking about the cardiovascular effects, and we were saying, oh, well, that's mostly endurance training and more intense training, but the levels there really aren't quite as high as you would think. So there's a study that actually evaluated this. I'm going to pull up a quote from that study. The title of the study is 25-Year Physical Activity Trajectories and Development of Subclinical Coronary Artery Disease as Measured by Coronary Artery Calcium, the Coronary Artery Risk Development in Young Adults Study. That's the Cardia study. And so they describe here at what level you begin to see these negative heart effects. The
association, yeah.
Exactly. And so I'm going to read this quote. They say, we identified 3 distinct physical activity trajectories. Trajectory 1, which is below physical activity guidelines. Trajectory 2, which is meeting those guidelines. And trajectory 3, which is 3 times the physical activity guidelines. And just for reference, so the physical activity guidelines they're using are about 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week. So that's 2.5 hours. So it's basically, what is that, about like 50 minutes 3 times a week. Or if you're looking at 4 times a week, it's just under 40 minutes, again, of moderate intensity activity. So this is really not all that much in terms of physical activity. Not that it's like this is, you could say, enough, but it's just not extreme amounts. And so they look at the odds ratio in terms of calcium artery scores between these 3 groups. And they say that trajectory 3 participants, these are the ones that had 3 times the physical activity guidelines, had higher adjusted odds of coronary artery calcium scores being above 0 versus those in trajectory 1. So this is comparing the people who are doing 3 times the physical activity guidelines compared to people who are doing below the physical activity guidelines. They then said that stratification by race showed that white participants who engaged in physical activity 3 times the guidelines had higher odds of developing calcium artery scores greater than 0. And then further stratification by sex showed higher odds for white males, and similar but non-significant trends were noted for white females. However, no such higher odds of calcium artery scores over 0 for trajectory 3 were observed in black participants. So an interesting note here in the difference between white and black participants, but not something we're really going to touch on. But to put that into maybe more normal terms, white males in this study who did 3 times the physical activity guidelines were 81% more likely to have increased coronary artery calcium scores compared to white males who were under the physical activity guidelines. And then for white females, it was 71% greater. So they're basically looking at people who are essentially inactive versus very active and finding that the inactive ones fared much better in terms of heart health compared to those that are excessively active.
Well, I just want to point out what coronary artery calcium score is. So the essentially a coronary artery calcium score is it looks at the amount of calcium deposited in the coronary arteries, which are the arteries around the heart. And when you have basically the way atherosclerosis develops is you start with the fatty plaques, which is usually just oxidized cholesterol and immune cells. And then that moves to a fibrosis, which is the deposition of collagen fibers. And after you have a loss of some of the muscular fibers at the coronary artery, and the arteries are very muscular. So in the muscular layer, which I think is called the intima, the media intima, if I can remember correctly. And then after that, it starts to calcify. So calcification is usually the last step of and it's not perfectly linear in its process, but it kind of moves into inflammation with the fatty deposit. After the fatty deposit, you have fibrosis, and then you have calcification. So the calcification is the last step. So when you're looking at a coronary artery calcium score, pretty sure they use it's a kind of like an X-ray or a CT, computed tomography scan, and they basically look at how much calcium is deposited around the coronary arteries, and there's a certain score. I don't know the different scoring off the top of my head, but if you're seeing a positive coronary artery calcium score, it means the arteries around your heart have been calcified. So what they're saying here is that with increased exercise, so I think it was 150 minutes per week, which is like 2 hours and 30 minutes, versus 450 minutes, which is like 7.5 hours, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing, if you're exercising at a moderate intensity, which I don't know what they define that as, for 7.5 hours a week over the course of time, the risk or the associated coronary artery calcium score is actually higher.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, another way of saying it is in terms of coronary artery calcium scores as a reflection of heart disease risk, you're at greater risk for heart disease if you exercise about an hour a day than if you exercise less than 2.5 hours a week.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I'm curious too, what this type of exercise can. I didn't read the study fully, so because there's your study, so I'm just curious, what their definition of this moderate intensity is, right? Because if I go to the gym and I do an hour of bicep and tricep, I don't think that's very taxing, Whereas
right.
if you're going to go do and you're going to go run for an hour every day on a treadmill or something like that, which is, I think, a more commonly accepted form of exercise, I think that would be more likely to be the problem. And I want to differentiate that because I think that there is a degree of what are you actually doing? Are you gonna go golf for an hour? Is that moderate intensity? It's doubtful to me that that's going to be problematic. But I do think, at least based on what I've read, and I guess from my personal opinion, that going and running on a treadmill for that an hour every day or whatever it is is more what they're leaning towards than some other forms of exercise. So I think it's important that we know what that is.
Well, so from the study, they stated that in their terms, moderate intensity activities included non-strenuous sports, walking and hiking, golfing and bowling, home exercises or calisthenics, and home maintenance or gardening. And then vigorous activities were running, jogging, racket sports, biking, swimming, exercise or dance classes, carrying or digging, shoveling, or lifting during leisure or strenuous sports. And the way that they do this is they weren't only looking at the moderate activity, it's just that the vigorous counts for more. So when you're looking at the physical activity guidelines of 150 minutes of moderate intensity, that would mean that for vigorous intensity, it would be less. I don't know exactly how much less, but maybe it would be 90 minutes of vigorous intensity activity would be equivalent of 150 of moderate. So I don't know what the exact guidelines would be in terms of vigorous, but when they were looking at it, they accounted for the differences in intensity between those things. But yeah, 150 minutes of moderate intensity, again, walking, golfing, home maintenance or gardening, this is not intense activity.